when you had to present your team's vision, your launch plan, you go to market with Jack, with the CMO and Leslie at the time. So you only maybe have like 30 minutes, like at max, like just to go there and then tell you, this is what we're gonna do, this is our plan, so just really just like you pack everything into that short 30 minutes and how do you get the most out of that and leave the room feeling confident, and like energized.
Welcome to Deep Dives. My name is Rid, and this is where we go deep with the best designers so that you can learn from their journey and apply it to your own career. A couple of years ago, I was interviewing Yuan Wang to lead design at Maven, and the two projects that she presented were one, leading the design of the original Twitter thread, and two, leading the first big redesign of the Airbnb marketplace. Needless to say, we hired her, and I learned more from working alongside Yuan than any designer in my career. She's a mentor to countless other designers, and so I wanted to start this conversation by learning more about how she built the original design mentorship program at Airbnb.
After I joined Airbnb, I had this opportunity to have lunch with the head of design operations at Airbnb design team. So she was asking me what was my number one observation of the design work. I paused for a moment and said I just noticed there are not that many women design leads in the organization. So when I joined, I think there were only 6 women who were in that role. In total there were almost 30 people that are in that level. So only 6 were women, and then only 3 were women of color. I was one of them. So that kind of started the whole conversation, and this was all on top of all the other day-to-day work that I was doing. But I just really felt compelled that I think this was something that's worth pushing. So I wrote a proposal and started the pilot program. There were about 35 mentees that joined, designers for content strategists or researchers, basically everybody in the larger design work. At the end, more than 90% of the participants would like to enroll in this program again. We also conducted some kickoffs and trainings, and so really make it kind of a holistic program to really for the success for this mentorship experience. We end up, hired a dedicated program manager to take over the operations so that I no longer had to do a lot of the, the manual stuff, but maybe became more of the spokesperson for this program, and then to advocate and to continue kind of, excite people to join.
I mean, it's cool because even just preparing for this, I was spending more time on your website and I was looking at the testimonials from all of the different coaching interactions that you've had in the past. And it is really clear that you've had a huge impact, but also just helped a lot of designers get unstuck in their career and feel energized about their craft and what they're doing. And so maybe we could even talk a little bit more about that. When you start working with a new client or someone that you're mentoring, what are some of those early questions that you are asking them to help them gain a little bit of clarity for their own career and start to visualize what those next goals are?
Yeah, I love this question because I think a lot of times at first when people come to me, I mean, of course now I position myself as a coach, so maybe there are some expectations for what kind of conversations you're going to have. But before that, people would just come to you and then want to get career advice, right? So I think it's interesting to think about what is advice and what is coaching, so because advice usually is something that's your experience and you believe it's right for you, and then you feel like someone else should also take that advice, right? But coaching is a very different kind of conversation because coaching is really focusing on that person and believe that person actually has the best answer. And then mentorship, it's also more of an advice kind of format. So because you are really learning from the person who's more senior, and then the person who's more senior knows the best answer, right? So I think it's really a flipped ways of encouraging that person and empowering that person to think about what's best for them. Once you start past beyond that level, things just get naturally more complicated, I guess. I think most of the time because you got more experience and you just have more options, really. You have so many pathways that you can think about, right? Do I want to be a manager? Do I want to continue growing an IC? Do I want to, is this the right time to start a family? How do I actually balance my work with my passion project? What about rest? So you just have so much more to really think about and juggle, in my opinion. So like a useful framework that I usually kind of walk them through is just called the pain and gain metric. So you can think about this like a 2x2 kind of metrics. You have your pain, you have your gain, and then you also have your current situation of where you are.
You talk about this idea of quieting your inner critic and visualizing your inner mentor. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Some people could talk about it maybe as like the imposter syndrome. It's more of less of like an imposter syndrome, but more we all have inner critic that doubt ourselves. The people that you have seen that are very confident, they just have a better relationship with their inner critic. I think just by acknowledging that, I think it normalizes the feeling that you're just not enough, and accepting that we all have inner critic, and your job is to recognize it and to understand what the message it's trying to tell you, and what are some of the intentions your inner critic has. Maybe your inner critic is trying to protect you. You know, like where does that come from? Think about your inner critic that has a volume button, so you can actually turn it down if you need it. And then the inner mentor concept, I think it's the flip side. You have an inner critic that may be doubting you, but you could also be thinking about, you know, mentor. This mentor could be someone that you look up to, or it could be, you know, people you just have qualities that you really aspire to become, or it could also be just an imaginary kind of, you know, voice. It's totally okay. And I think sometimes it helps when you are in a certain situation that you can ask yourself, like, what would my inner mentor do in this situation, you know, to kind of help you get out of your own ways of thinking and to challenge you to either, you know, be more thoughtful or be more confident.
I love how tailored it is to the individual. And I see why you kind of led by almost creating this opposite perspective of like, hey, this isn't necessarily advice, because advice is more broadly applicable perhaps. And a lot of this feels more like counseling to an extent, and really like getting into the weeds of what is ultimately motivating you. And it kind of honestly, it makes me think of like sometimes I hang out on the subreddit for UX design. I see a lot of people using it as an outlet to discuss some of the things that you're talking about, because it is anonymous and it's a little bit easier, and maybe that helps just to get things off your chest. And I see specifically over the last even 6 months, I've seen kind of an uptick in people who maybe don't feel like they have that same level of passion for design or the role, or just what their day-to-day is looking like. And it's a lot of people just using it as an open forum to talk about burnout. And I'm wondering, is that something that comes up frequently in your coaching conversations? And how do you kind of guide people through that stage of the career?
I think it's just really start with helping them understand their values first. What are some of the core values that's very important for you? I think that on its own, I think is a way to help you prioritize. There is this core value exercise that I sometimes do with my client. And I think by just really holding all these different things together, like, you know, asking you, like, what would you put at first? One philosophy I've learned, and I kind of share that with my clients, is like, how do we think about work instead of this constant going, you know, like, I know it's a luxury to think that you can stop in some time, but I think it's helpful to just at least think about approaching work in seasons. You know, like, we live in places where it has seasons. Like, you look at the plants around you, there are seasons that they grow, and then there are seasons that just like restore, and there's like nothing that's happening, but doesn't mean that they're not coming back. Like the perennials, they come back year after year, right? Like, would you like to be a perennial kind of plant, or would you like to be an annual plant? You bloom so much in 1 year, right? So like, how, if you were to think about a sustainable approach, like the nature, like the plants around you, maybe it's healthier to have a seasonal approach to your work. So like, then we start thinking about, like, what are the seasons that make sense for you to focus on work? And then what are the seasons that you can focus on rest?
I'd like to transition a little bit, because earlier this year I got the benefit of being able to look over your shoulder while you were reviewing all of these different portfolio websites throughout the hiring process. And I feel like a lot of people could really benefit from just getting a better sense of your own lens that you're using to view these different portfolio websites. And so maybe we could even think about that first 5, 10, 15 seconds after you click on a website. What are you looking for? And what are some things that designers can do to make a good impression?
I get that question a lot. Like, a lot of times designer will ask, like, how can I make my portfolio stand out? Right? Like, it's like a very common question. I think there is not that many like tricks, I guess. Like, I a lot of times my straight answer is good work stand out. So like focus on doing good work, like that's like the number one thing I felt like it's really important to hone in on. Like, if you don't think your work is, strong enough, like focusing on getting that work to a stronger place. So let's kind of maybe unpack a little bit about like, okay, what makes a good work, right? So I do think still, at least in our, like at Maven, what are the criteria that we have? It's we really care about craft here. That means I'm looking for strong visual and interaction design, details and representations. So I like to look at prototypes, either mobile or desktop, it's fine. But if you have done design work, like it's helpful to see that prototype. So you have them, show them off. And I think another common mistakes maybe that people neglect on their portfolio is that thumbnail. Like the thumbnail that you use to click into the case study. I think you could do so much more to make it interesting, exercise your design muscles to really differentiate. So we all know what the standard kind of thumbnails could probably look like. So yeah, like how can you differentiate yourself just from that? Because you can think about it as like even like an ad for your case study, like how can you make it interesting that people want to click and then to look at it, right? So that's, I think, different things, but in general, strong visual design and interaction details are the number one thing that I like to look at. And I think in terms of your narrative for the case study, this is also commonly seen from maybe graduates who came from boot camps because you were told to do all these methodologies and, showcase all the process with like raw sketches and wireframes and all that. So there's nothing wrong with doing these. I think it's awesome that, designers can, like, that you have the space to show that. But I think it's important to have your outcome first and then process being the second thing, because as a hiring manager, they will only care about the process if the outcome is good. So that goes back to doing good work. How can you make your actual work, the design part of the work, good? So if you don't think that final output is strong enough, like, okay, maybe the prototype is not polished enough, or maybe, I could show a little bit more wider range of explorations and like focus on those things first, so that you improve it. You can show it off like a little bit earlier in your case study so that people can see it early on, and then they will be more invested understanding how you get there. I think a lot of portfolio case studies just like straight up going through like timeline of all the process and stuff, and then at the end the outcome
big reveal.
Like, it's like not that great. So I just felt like it was really a missed opportunity. But good work stands out, so like focus on that. I think rather than just like adding all the methods and process, to justify the work itself. So I think that's really important, especially for junior level designers.
I love the point of like just giving people an idea of where you're going to, because if I'm 3 viewports into a portfolio project and I'm looking at sticky notes and I still don't know where we're going, you've lost me. Like, I'm out.
Yeah, totally. I think it's about how you think about the attention span also for your hiring manager, so that you could like design to impress or to show the best things earlier on. I think that's a strategy that it would be smart to incorporate for your site, right? And then I think the last piece, it's also being able to talk about impact in some degree. So like either it's in your portfolio or in your kind of verbal kind of walk through, to really help the person understand the impact with this work. I think startups, or like every company, I guess, but I felt like especially for startups, they love to hire designers who can design for impact, because you're so close to the business and so close to all the growth kind of opportunities. So like if you have work in that space, like really take the time to talk about, your understanding of the business, and then but also like maybe not every work is about improving business. It could also be about, organizational efficiency or culture improvements. But impact is impact. Like it doesn't need to be like particular metrics. I think just being able to speak about that, and it's a good way to reflect on your process, and a good way to showcase that you understand how to measure success for your work. I know some designers will be like, oh, like I don't have all the concrete metrics, or I left before this was shipped, or, so like that's fine. And acknowledge that that's the case, but still you should be able to talk about what are the benchmarks or signals you might look for if you were to measure the success, right? So like don't miss that opportunity to talk about it, because I think a lot of times it's less about like the exact numbers. You understand these concepts, and you can apply to those actual, scenarios. And that's the most important thing. So take the opportunity to like be more proactive, even if you don't have the numbers. I think that shows that you understand what hiring managers are looking for.
I'd like to return back to your billboard comment, and just this idea of like the advertisement for a portfolio project.
Sure.
So I think that's a pretty interesting way of thinking about it. And I've also kind of been tossing around this idea of like, what would it look like if we took a giant step back and kind of challenged the way that we think about the information architecture on a portfolio site? Because I saw this tweet, and it was from Daryl Ginn, who he has the Godly design website. Mm-hmm. And he said, no one is reading your case study. Just put all of your recent work in order on mm-hmm. one page mm-hmm. and make it easy to find. Watch what mm-hmm. happens.
If you look at the people with my level of experience, I guess, like people that I've worked together with, like if you look at their portfolio, like there's like no one format, really. I think we only start talking about a format for a case study because I think there's a lot of people like I would say maybe more of a junior level, like doesn't have a lot of super concrete like experience that you could ship. So then there's a lot of case studies that you have done to prove that you understand the concept. So then when you start working in an actual place, you realize like every place has a very different process, and you don't have time to do personas all the time or to do all the different iterations, right? So like naturally, the way you present your work later on in your career, like it would just all be very different because every project gets shipped in different fashion. There's many different processes that had gone through to get to that point. I think there are no wrong ways to maybe like organize the work itself, as long as it's suitable to the nature of that project, right? So like I think it's totally okay to not talk about like the details of how the iterations at a site, and then just to focus on the things that you shipped. Like especially if you are a designer who has shipped a lot of things in like some well-known companies, then like you don't have to go into all the details, right? Just like show the best stuff, like kind of like the what is it called, like the highlight reel that like the 3D designers usually would pack together, right? It's just like a trailer of like all the super cool stuff that they made. I think maybe we designers, like product designers, should do more of that too.
Yeah, I like that idea. It makes me think about like where certain types of content should live in your site. Because mm-hmm. I think I see too many websites right now where you come to the page, there's some generic heading about they're a designer who cares. And then you have, 3 to 6 cards below, and it's a thumbnail that probably just doesn't really actually communicate that much, and then a title of a project, and that's it. And I'm expected to click on one of these, and there's not like a narrative there. There's that's like the dominant theme that I see on a lot of websites, where it's like there's not that much of a narrative. And so I had kind of been putting myself through this exercise of like, let's say I was 2-3 years into my career, what would I do on my homepage? And I think an interesting strategy that I would explore is taking more of the content from case studies, putting it on that homepage where it read more as this like cohesive story, Maybe like I like your point of like maybe it should feel a little bit more like a scissor reel than a grid of cards, and have someone be able to come to my page and be able to like understand what I've worked on, what the timelines are, what the highlights are, without having to click on anything, and then treat those case studies almost like an appendix for someone who wants to go a little bit deeper. And it also makes me think of this tactic that I saw reviewing portfolios, I think it was last month. And there's this guy named Matt Baird, and he did something really, really interesting where on his portfolio pages, his breakdown of the project was quite short, actually. He just told the highlights, and he really put a lot of emphasis into having nice visuals that captured like the core prototype and then maybe like the core screens. And then he actually embedded a Figma slide deck at the bottom of his website. Only if you are interested in going that third level deeper, you could click in and get all of the details. And I thought that was a really interesting approach versus having this giant wall of text. And it kind of makes me, now I want to ask, like, is there anything that you've seen over your last few months of reviewing different portfolio websites that has stood out or you thought was like unique or interesting or captured your attention?
There has been kind of a shift, maybe just because like now it's more okay to do like a password gated if you have like more of like confidential type of things, but you only wanted to show it for the right audience and not just be public for everyone. I think that's totally understandable. I see a lot of works get sent that way. You put in a password, then you actually get a lot of more in-depth like portfolio, whether it's a deck or it's like a web page. That really helps you get a deeper understanding of the candidate's like skill set. I think that's good. So if you think, if you are thinking about interviewing and you feel like you have a lot of things you could show, but you don't feel comfortable putting them all on your website, like that's probably like one approach that you could consider. I've also like seen, of course, there's so many different hosting platforms and there's so many conversations about like which one is better and, do you need the framework or do you need a Webflow? And I think these are all great options, but focus on good work, So like your portfolio site can help you, but like the platforms and all that like can help you, but the work itself has to still be good, to help, really help you stand out. So I have given strong yes to candidates who just host their content on Notion, it's not because the site is that impressive. It's well organized. It's as Notion helps it, but it's actually a lot more about the content that you talk about how you talk about your projects, how you introduce yourself, and how I can help like understand you as a designer and your ways of thinking about problems. That makes a big difference. So I think it's easy to feel like, oh, like Webflow or this site would help make my portfolio better, but I would challenge to actually like not start there and to actually focus on your actual work and your story, and so that you have a more compelled thing to show, and then you can pick whatever project like platforms that you would like to host it. I feel like that in my mind it's the right priority for thinking about your portfolio.
You're saying my fancy 3D spline animation on my new shiny framer site doesn't matter?
I would love to have that myself, actually. Yeah, I think it's sick. Like I love spline. Like that's one thing that I like to learn more, actually.
Another area that I feel like I've just benefited so much from being able to observe you is looking at how you present your work and how you shape this narrative internally. And so I'd like to do a little hypothetical here and create a spectrum, actually, where on one end of the spectrum we have the meaty projects that you're taking on with Maven today. And on the other end of the spectrum, I want to go all the way back to 2017. You're leading the design of the original Twitter thread. Okay. So we have like this 6-year period. What are some of the main ways that you've grown as a communicator during that time? And how does it take form in the way that you ultimately present your work internally?
That's the environment. These are two really interesting anchor points because, like, if I think about the environment that I'm at Maven, like the how many stakeholders or like how we make decisions, like versus at Twitter at the time, it's like so different. I think you really had to tailor the way you communicate or you get alignment based on the culture and the organizational dynamic in the place. That's why I felt like it's interesting to experience like work in different places, because every place you realize is like very different, like how decision gets made or how priority gets set, right? Like a big company already public versus a company trying to go IPO versus a startup still, trying to figure things out. So when I was working on the Twitter thread project, obviously it was like a pretty big higher priority for the entire work, and also because we designed for Twitter, like this is a like foundational change to how tweets are showing up. When you make a change like that, everything else gets impacted, like the how you monetize a tweet, how like it gets shown in a DM. So like every single team pretty much will need to know, okay, like this change is coming, like how are we going to like adapt to this new dynamic, right? So I think being the design lead on that project, I think a lot of the times beyond just the work itself, it's also about like rallying other designers or other organizations to understand what's coming, to work together to make sure things don't break when we ship. So I think a lot of that on its own is like a whole set of collaboration and communication, and that's unique to more of a larger company where you have a lot of stakeholders and your product really is like so core and central that touches so many things, and that's very different from like the Maven world right now. And I think the other area, which was, like high stake kind of presentation, when you had to present your team's vision, your launch plan, you go to market, with Jack, with the CMO and Leslie at the time. So you only maybe have like 30 minutes, like at max, like just to go there and then tell you, this is what we're going to do. This is our plan. So just really just like you pack everything into that short 30 minutes and how do you get the most out of that and leave the room feeling confident, and like energized. So like I think there's certainly things that like it's not just designers, like design PM usually kind of go into that kind of conversations together. And I think how you feel about the work really matters too. Like if you feel confident and you like excited, then yes, like people will feel that energy. I think this goes to like I think any kind of presentation, you want to hype yourself up in some ways. So I think during that period, like I had like you always maybe have a couple things maybe you hold on to that it's your lucky charm maybe when you're in that kind of situation. Like for me, it's like I have a specific pair of heel shoes that I will always wear when I go to a high stake like presentation. Like it. So like probably like Jack will always see me wearing the same kind of shoes like going to that presentation. It just somehow like I just like, okay, this is a moment, I'm gonna wear these shoes, I'm gonna kill it. So just like mentally set yourself ready for that big stage. It's not big, it's a small conference room, but still like
it's pretty big.
Really really just get ready, like mentally prepare for it. So I think that's helpful for me. There's something that you're like looking forward to, and then I think because it's also a high stake kind of situation, like you kind of want to come prepared, right? So like, and then you also want to make the senior leadership felt like you heard them, if they have feedback, like you heard them, but you had to like, what are ways you can tell them that this is not gonna work, because they might have like very different, like very crazy ideas about how a tweet, like a thread card should look like, and then they would propose a lot of interesting stuff maybe, but you kind of had to tell them this is cool, but like hey, here are the 5 reasons why it might not work. So we kind of, had to, like, there was like one presentation, we kind of got more into the details, and then I had to prepare kind of, showcasing some directions just to like, hey, this is how it would look in different places in DMs, and this is how it will look in like, other places. Like this will break the system, and if we go this way, right? So just to help them visualize and see, oh, the team had thought about this very thoughtfully. Let me just put my gun down and just like, yeah, okay, like I trust your team to make this decision, right? So it's just how you're designed to acknowledge their input, but also like hold your ground. I felt like that was, like a tactic that has been helpful for dealing with these type of feedback with like top down. So yeah, I think these are kind of the main things more during the Twitter times. I would say like Maven is so small that, you don't kind of spend like 2 days trying to pack like a presentation just to like show it in the review, right? Like you don't do that because we work so fast and we like quick, feedback cycle, right? So I think sometimes it's more helpful when you can show like what your thought process is, and this is the direction you're thinking. Maybe there are a couple options, but you can either share that async or live for a more rich conversation and discussion. I felt like there is definitely some similarities, like still like you want to be clear about what feedback you're looking for, so that the team and your stakeholders understand how to be most helpful for the conversation. I think that's like a level set. It's always good to have for any kind of conversation, like especially critique kind of conversation. Like, are you looking for feedback on this prototype, or are you looking for feedback on the, general directions? Are you looking for just like interaction details feedback? So like, I mean, obviously your audience matters. Maybe you want to tailor your feedback for the audience so that they also can feel the most useful in that conversation. So I think like there is still like a lot of, I think, similarities in different kind of organizational settings. Yeah, that's overall thought process.
The high level stakes presentation for something like Twitter is obviously, it sounds like it's a little bit later in the design process. You've thought through a lot of things. You probably have a more narrow set of concepts that you are interested in for it to get to that point. Is that accurate?
That's true. I think one thing I didn't talk about, but it was at the early stage, we did have more of a sprint cycle. So we did have like almost like a 1 to 2 week, like a 2 week, I think it was maybe 1.5, but the most compact was like a 1 week sprint. We had 2 designers, so me and Stammy. So like both of us were working on like one person on consumption, one person on like creation. And we just were like cranking out like directions and prototypes, and we do like a daily, at the end of the day, like check-in with the VP of product. We kind of do daily check-ins with him just to really get quick feedback loop. And this was before we kind of like green light the entire project. So we kind of just like, oh, let's do this. Let's see how we can take this concept and where can we go with. And then we end up like, at a pretty good place. And then later on like assemble the team, like put engineers behind it. So at the time before, it was just like 1 p.m. 2 designers basically like working on concepts and have daily check-ins with our product VP for about like 2 weeks.
Let's compare and contrast that presentation with something that would maybe happen today. And I'm really interested in looking earlier in the design process as well. So like, let's say that there's buy-in around a specific problem area, and there's still a lot of flexibility in terms of where the design could ultimately go. And so like tomorrow, hypothetically, you have a slot at Crit, and you have these 30 minutes to share what you were thinking with different stakeholders. Can you walk us through your process of preparing for that meeting? And I'm specifically interested in how you think about what your deliverable should be, and like what are you showing and how are you guiding those 30 minutes?
I think always, for Crit, like I like to think about what I would like to walk away with, what input would help me get the most clarity for the work that I'm doing. Like, what questions do I have that I would like to get feedback from this person with like the entire group. So I think I usually start there, and then I'll work backwards from that, and then try to organize my work, or like how I want to present the work in that way, so that naturally, after some context and directions and space for debate, like I would kind of queued up those questions so that we could have these like targeted conversations. I think it's easy to feel like you're out of control sometimes in certain crit situations. If you're like, oh, I come in to like present work and I wanted to talk about A, but then like everybody else started looking at this like B and C and D, like I was just like, I end up not getting the feedback I want for A, right? So this is like, a lot of times it could be a larger problem with just like the problem you're trying solving. Maybe that's, a sign, but sometimes, it's also just like how you can guide people and how you can facilitate these things in that 30 minutes. I think it showcases a designer's ability to acknowledge questions, understand what it's worth discussing now, or what's worth discussing later on. What are something maybe you have thought about, but not having to like show it all during that time, right? So I really believe that credits something that the presenter should control. It's not like something that there should be like a top-down kind of approach. So you should make the best use of that time. So whatever is most useful for you, that's the most useful of a crit. Be clear about what feedback you're looking for going in, and then work backwards. I think that's the most useful thought framework that I have. And then I think it also, sometimes in crit conversations, I've seen designers sometimes get too deep too quickly into the micro details, and then they kind of lost track of the larger problem or the business context. For people maybe like not a designer, or like someone who haven't seen this project for a while and just like showed up in crit, they might have a lot of questions about like, why are we doing this, so like it really depends on who are in their room, because like being able to read a room, it's helpful. So if you know this person, like a lot of people don't have a context for this project, maybe you should spend some time setting up a context for why you're doing this, why this is a problem worth solving, so that you can answer those questions, address them first, and then you can get into more of the concrete solutions and presenting them. I think that's helpful. I felt like it's maybe a reminder for people just to think in the 2x kind of framework. So it's like zoom out just one level up versus go too far. You feel like you have to cover all the different spectrums, like maybe think about the 2-year vision, or like, but then also there's like things that your engineer is going to ship like next week. Like that's like too far of the spectrum, right? So I think like understand what that 2x means for your project helps you look more prepared. And then it also helps, I think, everyone on the panel, like the crit, understand the larger scenarios, like, but just enough to make good feedback, I believe. So I think that's I think the context for good feedback. I guess there could also be zoom out 2x could also be you have these detail level concepts, right? But what if you actually zoom 2x so that you actually summarize like these 5 different concepts into 2 directions, so then you can actually debate on a higher level, like the directional level, with your cross-functional partners, because they might have more opinions about that level versus the details. So when you can kind of visualize your thought process that way, you actually can guide the conversation. They may disagree with like, option 1A, but like, but they actually were bought into this direction 1, but they just, maybe there needs to be like a 1D, that's just different. But like, that's kind of sometimes to use these kind of hierarchies to help you understand where do your stakeholder align. Do they align at this like foundation, like detailed level, or is it more like we all bought in this level of direction, but maybe the detail execution needs to be iterated? Okay, like we can do that. Like that's still a really good output from a crit, right? So like you get that some kind of alignment, but you know what are the next level of things that you need to work on. How can designers create these type of artifacts or like hierarchies of information so that you can use it to understand where other people are at?
I love the idea of kind of grouping concepts into these higher level directions, this 2x view. You said this phrase, visualizing your ideas. Can you go a little bit deeper onto that? Let's say you're sharing your screen in a Zoom call. What actually is on that screen? How do you think about the best thing to visually put in front of the stakeholders in the room in order to get the output and the outcome that you're looking for?
If you're like, depends on the level of input you're looking for. So like sometimes you're really just looking at a higher level strategy, like should we work on A? That maybe that's like a type of question. So like you're not really gonna get into the detailed pixel level of like what A would look like, right? So maybe you will actually spend more time talking about customer interview feedback. Like you might have screenshots of like, these are things that our customers are saying from our surveys, to back it up. Or there might be also just kind of confusions from our existing product, and you can kind of visualize that, like, maybe there are how many entry points are in this place that it's confusing, or how can you actually strengthen your argument. Basically you're trying to make a point, right? So what is that point you're trying to make, and then what are the evidence that you have to support that point, right? Is it through customer interviews, or is it through your kind of design lens, like like understanding, using your design foundational knowledge to make a critique of that? Or is it actually looking at the data to, like, the data will tell you, like, we have a problem with leaky bucket, like, people are dropping off in this onboarding flow. So I think these are just like questions maybe that you can anticipate that people might have, like what are probably the things that they may say when they ask you, right? So then you can anticipate these questions and prepare ahead of time. So like these are maybe like that type level of conversations, how I would think about it. And then I think the more day-to-day, like, like we have a bunch of directions for this project, this is how it could look like and how user will use it. I like to pack them into some like higher level directions. I think sometimes it's helpful to name your explorations so that like it's easy for people to grasp, like, oh, this is like the drawer concept, and that is like the sheet concept, so like whatever kind of ways you could do to like help people understand, like these are two different concepts, and then it's easy for them to also talk about them, right? Like give feedback. So like these are like small things. I think it helps when you are like doing explorations. And I also seen designers who just like go through like 7, 8 like different concepts in this one crit, and then people just get bored because like, oh, they all look kind of the same to me. So I think, yeah, how can you organize your thought process and do some editing so that you are creating like some very different directions to try to understand maybe where are people at the spectrum, right? You could just have like a really basic idea maybe, and then there's like a wild idea, and there maybe it's like something in the middle. I think you do that as well. I remember seeing that. So like,
I like spectrums, yeah.
Yeah, so you kind of really help people understand, like, oh, cool, like maybe the crazy one is not so crazy. And so then because they have the comparison, like they understand, okay, like, let's go more wild. So instead of like trying to just iterate on small things, like how can you push your thinking so that you can create these like more wide range concepts for really effective feedback. I think that's a skill I think designers should like continue to do more. And just enough options, like not too many. I think that's also really important.
That was something that I totally learned from you. I have like my secret Notion page of just like all the little tidbits that I've picked up that I just want to remember for future roles.
Aww.
And one of the things that really stood out to me is we were working on these concepts, like how do you preview a course quickly coming from a homepage? And you had this really cool concept, but what I took away from it is you gave it a name, and you gave it the CL Peak, which we had this acronym CLP, and you created CL Peak, the easiest way to just like get what you need without having to open up a new route. And I think it directly contributed to the amount of buy-in that we had because it was so easy to refer to. It was so memorable. And another way that you can kind of use this naming strategy that I have definitely picked up from you is having summary slides as well. Like at the end of your presentation, having this like summary side, what do I want to leave up on Zoom when we're having a bunch of conversation about what we just talked about? And maybe you have a very low fidelity representation of these different concepts. Maybe they are living on some kind of a spectrum, but they definitely have that name so that people can easily point to it and talk about it. And so like even just facilitating that conversation after your presentation is done, and what is that visual that you leave up there, that's something that I have also noticed you take very seriously, and it's really helps drive that conversation forward.
It's a lot of communication. I think, especially I felt like if you like, I never worked at agency, but I do feel like agency type of communicating, it's like you really gotta make people believe in the thing that you are presenting, right? So like there is certainly a lot of kind of ways of communicating or tactic that's probably really effective. So I think I probably learned some of these things from other people who have more agency backgrounds in the past.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground. I don't want to keep you forever. Is there anything that you still feel like you want to share, or questions that you think that I should be asking?
Well, I think, like a lot of people probably listen to this podcast or, thinking about your career and how to grow yourself. And I think it is not an easy environment it's today, particularly. So I do think it's oftentimes it can feel like you're not making progress. I just want to say that like there are still things that you can control, like which are improving your skills. So like how can you leverage the time and then the space that you have during this moment to focus on the skills you want to develop and then the experience you want to collect versus chasing for certain title or companies that make you maybe feel good about yourself. I think the skills, in my opinion, will really serve you far. I think our industry now has maybe made all of us feel impatient in some ways about results. We want to get quick results fast. A lot of us are proud of our craft because we love that aspect, and good craft does take time, and it takes just day-to-day exposure and things that you simmer ideas and you spark on different directions. So be patient, I guess, with the results. Consistency will certainly serve you far.
Yeah, I love that point on consistency. I think that's, at the end of the day, one of the attributes or qualities that matters most in the long run. And so I'm glad that we ended there. Thank you, Yuan. This has been amazing. I feel like I've learned so much from you, and just being able to share that with others has been great. I know it's going to be really valuable. And final plug, again, if you want to work with Yuan at Maven, go to maven.com/careers. You will not regret it. That is all.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. So good to see you again.